Hello, everyone. It's Francis Widdowson here. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations. We've had a bit of a break, but I'm hoping to have more of these episodes. And today, my guest is James McCrae. And James and I have known one another for a couple of years. We're actually on a discussion group about the residential schools that involves around 20 people. And what we're going to do today is we're going to follow the typical format of the Rational Space Disputations, which for people who are unaware of that format, what happens is that I ask the guest questions for 1 hour, and then the screens are turned and the guest asks me questions for an hour. And the reason for this is so that anything that's left out can be covered, and it makes it fair. So someone is not going to be put on the spot for an hour or 2 hours without being able to take control of the situation and answer anything which they think is not properly represented. And with the Rational Space Disputations, the idea here is not to shy away from points of disagreement. So if James or myself feels that we have a point of contention that we need to get to the bottom of, then we will try to do that. Although often we see there's quite a lot of common ground that people have who come on this program. Anyway, so welcome to the Rational Space Disputations, Jim.
Thank you, Dr. Widdowson.
You can call me Francis.
Thank you. Please call me Jim.
Okay, sounds good. So I think before we begin, you can perhaps tell the audience something about yourself and what you think are important things for them to know.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this, Francis. I appreciate it very much. For most of my life, I have lived amongst Indigenous fellow Canadians, right from the time when I was a little boy in Alberta and British Columbia to a little later in Manitoba and on. I have always wondered why it is that Indigenous kids did not have what I had. And I was not from a rich family. We were relatively poor, as a matter of fact. However, I always wondered what's going on. Why is this like this? A little later, it became very clear that their lives began and continued far behind mine. This bothered me for most of my earlier years. I became a court reporter back in 1969, and in Winnipeg. And part of the job was to fly out to remote Indigenous communities to record the court proceedings in those places. However, there was always time to visit and look around and see what was going on. I was shocked initially because even I didn't know things were the way they were in terms of the lack of opportunity, the despair, the dependence that I think is the reason for all of that. So fast forward a little bit, I ended up working in the House of Commons for about 8 years as a Hansard reporter there, recording the debates and speeches and so on in the House of Commons. That kind of inspired me to remain interested, at least. I took an opportunity to get back to Brandon, Manitoba, which was my home prior to being in Ottawa and working there. And again, as a court reporter for a little while, doing the same things I was doing previously. In '86, I was fortunate enough to be elected to the Manitoba legislature. In '88, my party, the Progressive Conservative Party, won that election, and with a minority, but we won. And I was immediately appointed Attorney General for Manitoba. Well, most attorneys general in history have been lawyers, and I'm not one. So we look forward to an interesting time. For 5.5 years, I served in that capacity. And during all the years as a minister in Gary Filmon's government, covering a number of portfolios, I was able to travel again. to a number of Indigenous communities. Again, I was taken aback as much as before by how conditions had still not changed, that things were still not good in reserve communities, and more Indigenous folks were moving into the cities and towns as well. In 1999, my career in provincial politics was brought to an end, and I maintain today that my greatest regret from all of my experience has been that I could not and did not do more than I did to make lives better for ordinary Indigenous Manitobans. And obviously, I worried as well about Indigenous people right across Canada. I still do. I started writing articles mostly to do with the inequality that exists in our country several years back. Basically, after I finished a 3-year term as a Canadian citizenship judge, the Harper government appointed me to the Canadian Citizenship Commission. And I spent 3 years doing these wonderful citizenship ceremonies and celebrating Canada and what a wonderful country we have. All these smiling people and their beautiful children coming and being so happy to become Canadians. But when I finished those 3 years, I began doing some writing. I'm not a great writer, but I write. And it always very often came back to that inequality business. And that brought me to the 1970 white paper brought forward by the Pierre Trudeau government. I never liked Mr. Trudeau very much. I was a conservative for one thing, but I just didn't like his way of running our country. However, on further review of that white paper, I thought, well, that would have been part of a very good answer to moving forward. But that was like 53 years ago. We've done nothing since then to address the issues contained in that white paper, which would have moved us a great distance in these last 53 years toward a better life for ordinary Indigenous Canadians. You'll notice I use the word ordinary quite often because those are the people I'd like to think I'm speaking for. Maybe they don't want me to speak for them, but I'm going to do it anyway because they're my fellow Canadians. And I feel very strongly about that. So as I approach our discussion today, Francis, I'm saying there's been over 500 years of contact with European Canadians and other Canadians and Indigenous Canadians. The 1876 Indian Act, in my view, is a racist document. And if everybody's so against racism in our country, why do we still have that? Why has no government in the last 50 years, at least 53, done nothing about that? In fact, the new Trudeau government is moving in exactly the opposite direction of that proposed by his dad. So I end up with a little more respect for Pierre Trudeau than I used to have. But believe me, that's not on all issues, but it certainly is on this one. So that 500 years plus, Francis, you would think we would, as a civilized society, you would think we would have come a lot further than we have. And so I've written about why. Why have we not come further? And sometimes, if you recall, it was the leadership of Indigenous Canadians who stood against that 1970 white paper. And so I draw quite a big distinction between the leadership, which includes the advocates, the media, the politicians who continue to support the apartheid style system we have in Canada. I continue to stand against them, preferring to throw my lot in with so-called ordinary Indigenous Canadians. I want a better life for them for the future. And that's why I do what I do. There's a lot more I can say, but you're probably ready for your next question, Francis.
Yeah, so there's a couple of tacks that we can take. Before we start moving on to the Indigenous kind of area, perhaps you mentioned that you're very critical of the Pierre Trudeau approach to governing Canada. What was your main kind of opposition to the Pierre Trudeau government?
My people began as social credit people in Alberta, which I think you'll agree, Francis, is not very liberal.
No.
And so basically, my upbringing has been a fairly conservative upbringing. And my experience as a Hansard reporter in Ottawa, watching Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Clark and Mr. Stanfield and these people within a few feet of my elbows as the reporter there, I was able to size them up pretty well, in my opinion, at least over those 8 years. And I came away from Ottawa in 1982, more convinced than ever that I was a conservative. So it's basically my philosophy is more conservative than it is liberal, and that's, you know, maybe it's not fair to Pierre Trudeau that I feel this way, but issues about the West bothered me. I'm from the West. I'm a Westerner, even though I'm a Manitoban. Some people are a little confused about that, but I'm not. You know, it's really hard to put my finger on it, but I felt that there was an arrogant approach involved with the liberal administration of Pierre Trudeau, and we're certainly seeing it with his son's administration. So I hope that answers that point.
Well, it sounds a little bit, I'm not sure if you heard this. I'm not sure if it's John Ibbitson who's referred to this Laurentian elites, like that kind of idea. So is that sort of that you have this kind of central Canadian kind of group of elites who have a particular approach to governing, which doesn't consider properly sort of the hinterland, I guess, or the outskirts of the country, or the West and the East. Often this is seen as central Canada versus other regional areas. Is that sort of one of the main criticisms?
I'm afraid that I fell into that, Francis. Yes, and my attendance in Ottawa for 8 years actually made those feelings stronger. And then later on in the late 80s and early 90s, dealing with the Meech Lake Accord as Gary Filmon's Minister of Constitutional Affairs, and later the Charlottetown Accord, I could feel that division more than ever. It's not gone away. We don't talk about it every day anymore, and I'm glad for that. But there are still strong feelings in certain parts of the West that are very concerned about that Laurentian elite running our country.
Yes.
So I still have that, and I try to be fair about it, because during Meech Lake and Charlottetown, I was working to try to find a way to accommodate what I thought were the legitimate demands of the province of Quebec. I supported the attendance of Indigenous leaders at those talks. All kinds of room was made for their point of view, and you'll find it in those documents, rejected as they were by Canadians generally.
Yes.
But there was a genuine effort in those days to bring the country together by well-meaning politicians from all parties. And I was impressed by the Native leadership at those discussions as well. But as you recall, the chiefs, thumbs down.
Well, that's a common, this seems to be a common pattern that does happen, is that it's agreement doesn't seem to be forthcoming on anything like this.
Well, one of the pieces I've written has to do with that point. If there's 630 First Nations in our country, and they all have their points of view, and they're obviously not going to be the same, that is a problem.
Yeah.
That stops progress.
Yes, and interests like what do they have common interests that they're trying to pursue? They don't seem to have common interests because often they're in competition with one another for access to, and I'm not sure if you've heard of this literature. I don't want to talk too much about it because we can get into it later. The rentier state type of literature, the idea of a rentier state type of politics, which is you have transfers that go out, which doesn't allow commonality amongst those that are trying to get the transfers. They compete with one another. And so trying to have politics on that basis, some kind of agreement becomes very, very difficult. And as we can see, as you mentioned, if you have 630 plus kind of entities that are trying to get access to the transfers, it makes politics very, very fractious.
Well, if you think a federal government trying to deal with 10 provincial governments and 3 territories is complicated.
Yes.
Try working with 630 plus more entities,
yes.
which claim sovereignty, which I certainly I could just
yes.
talk about that all day, I guess.
Yes. So the Indian Act, you mentioned that it's a racist document. Why do you think that the Indian Act is a racist document?
I say that because it resembles so much what I know, and I don't know a lot, but I know a little about the apartheid system that was in South Africa. It was brought to an end. It was apologized for, and yet we don't do that here. We still have the apartheid that exists in the Indian Act. We have, and the treaties. Let's not leave them out of the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
These instruments hive indigenous communities into little reserves, some of them not so little, but so many of them have little few resources to draw on in order to create a life or employment or a better life. So the Indian, that's part of it. The fact is that there's so many different kinds of, quote, Indians, as set out in the Indian Act. The fact that whether it's the act or the treaties, I'm not an expert, but something prevents people from owning property in these communities. I guess the concept that we're dealing with the collective as opposed to individuals. You and I perhaps rejoice that we have individual rights in our country, but the Indian Act prevents that for Indigenous people. To me, that's racist.
And so you see the prohibition or the difficulties in having Indigenous rights. That's what you see to be racist, or is there something else racist about it?
Well, if you look at our Constitution, there's a section 35, I think it is, that singles out Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think there should be lots of different ways we should celebrate and acknowledge the contributions of Indigenous people to the culture, to the richness that we have in our country. That said, no other group needs to be, group or individual, needs to be singled out for different treatment. Some people call it special. I don't. I call it different because if you wanted to call it special, my question to you would be, how's it working so far?
Yeah.
It's simply not right in a free and democratic country like ours to single out a group and treat a group different from the way we treat individuals. I thought the Constitution was there to protect the rights of individuals. And now we're talking about the rights of collectives when we're talking about Indigenous communities. And given the performance of the chiefs over the past 53 years, I'm not comfortable on behalf of ordinary Indigenous people that they're getting a fair deal.
So you're arguing in favor of getting rid of the Indian Act?
Absolutely.
So when that happens, if that were possible, which they've been trying to do it, this has been an ongoing thing since the white paper, trying to get rid of the Indian Act, and it doesn't seem to be easy to do. But let's say we were able to do that. What do you think would happen? Like, look, why would that be something that would improve the lives of like the marginalized, dependent Indigenous people?
Well, my understanding of the white paper was that getting rid of the Indian Act and the other changes involved were designed or proposed to be done in a gradual way. So that, I mean, you can't all of a sudden say to all the people who have been dependent on the federal government, at least since 1876 and before that as well.
Yeah.
You can't just all of a sudden say, okay, everything's changed. That's not fair. It's not right to do it that way. I'm not a bureaucrat, so those questions do need to be addressed, though, Francis. If the bottom line is let's get rid of the racism that's implicit in the system, so step by step, but it can't be done without cooperation. And we go back to the problem that you referred to, the lack of unity amongst the Native groups themselves. I mean, if you wonder about division amongst Indigenous leadership, just look what happened to Roseanne Archibald in recent times.
Yeah,
that's just one example. I mean, you can say what you want about Ms. Archibald, but the point is that kind of division isn't new in the organization, in the AFN organization. And then we have the Métis groups and the Inuit groups, and they all have different objectives. This is a problem that we need to find a way. And Trudeau, he was Prime Minister, Pierre was. He thought, well, maybe we can make this work. He tried, but the whole thing was scotched by the chiefs. And so we'll never know how it would have worked unless we begin the process again.
Yeah, we can sort of hypothesize, though, based upon what it would do. And I should mention, this is a very, very important document, and readers might not be all that familiar with it. But the white paper, and it wasn't originally called that, it got called that. They were trying to actually avoid calling it the white paper. I think it was on green pages. Anyway, the Indian Act was one of the areas, but another one was to help the groups that needed it most. Like it had a kind of a somewhat of an approach where you would be focusing on the economic circumstances as opposed to the tribal kind of affiliations. And there were, I'm just trying to think of the other kinds of aspects, but the Indian Act was one of them.
But don't you think, Francis, that approach that you've just referred to is the kind of approach that we use with our equalization formula and our relations one province to the other? Is that what you're talking about?
No, I think it was more, see, that's just looking at it on a regional basis. So you have two kinds of inequalities that can be looked at. One is the actual individual incomes. So like if you send equalization payments to a province, that doesn't really necessarily do anything to address the inequalities within a province. So you're trying to reduce inequalities between provinces, but you don't necessarily, by doing that, reduce inequalities within provinces. And the white paper, I don't quite know what I'm just trying to think, because I did study the white paper many years ago, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It was probably, again, that, as you correctly pointed out, this equalization type of argument that you were going to focus on the bands themselves, and whether you had a very poor band versus a very rich band, and then the poor band should be the one that has attention, not the rich band. But of course, sending money into the poor band doesn't necessarily mean that the income within the band is going to be distributed equally, and probably will not be.
Well, you're talking to a layman here today, Francis, and what I perceived is that the failure of that white paper has represented the failure of the past 53 years to make better progress. Shoveling money is obviously something that has to happen for certain reasons, but I think Ottawa always thinks just money is the response, and it's not the right one.
Yes.
It's
Well, certainly, and that we can get into this more when I'm talking about it, my own theories about this. But services, so like educational services, like how is whatever it is that the government is doing improving the services in the Indigenous communities? I think that is one of the biggest questions.
Stephen Harper brought in, with the support of the leadership of the AFN, a bill to address Indigenous education by Indigenous people. That got all the way to the point where the chiefs again scotched it.
Yes.
And the leader of the AFN, his name escapes me at the moment, but he resigned over it.
Yes.
This is another example of what I'm talking about.
Yes. So what is this? So what is going on here, Jim? Why is there this obstructionism to progress in your view?
Well, there are people.
The big question.
There are people who will want to condemn me, and there already are. But for what I'm about to say, there's too much money flowing to the leadership without accountability for better progress to be made. Does that cover it?
Okay, so you see it as a problem of the leadership.
I surely do. I have for a long, long time.
And why do you think that that's the problem?
Since, well, in the last 50 years, the leadership has gained more and more power and influence, always supported by the federal government, and to some extent other governments as well. They are ensconced, I think is the word, in a system that rewards the leadership, but does not do very much for the ordinary Indigenous person. That system is there, and here I blame the media a lot, because the media never seems to talk about these lack of accountability issues amongst Indigenous leadership. I remember a quick example. I know this hour is going very fast. A quick example, I met when I was Attorney General in my office in Winnipeg with about a half dozen Indigenous women. Those women were complaining to me about how there's no accountability on their reserve, how their kids were not getting educated like some other kids in the community were, that the best housing went to the people who were related or depended, as they put it, depended on which family you were part of, whether you got the better housing. Those women asked me as an Attorney General to investigate and do something about that. And I asked them, okay, well, I can't do much unless you tell me names and specific examples. They backed off right away, those women. They didn't want their names used. But I did, however, report my meeting to the RCMP. And again, the RCMP told me, well, we can't do anything unless you give us more detail. Yes. So nothing got done. And it appears nothing very good has happened since.
Yes. Speaking of leadership, I definitely do not want to miss discussion about this, because I think this is one of the key kinds of controversies that you've been involved in. Murray Sinclair. So Murray Sinclair is a major leader. Like, he would be one of the most prominent leaders of Indigenous.
Eminence grise.
Pardon?
Eminence grise.
What is that? Sorry, I'm not sure what that means.
It's a French word that describes somebody you never question.
Okay, yes, okay. Never questioned. And you had a bit of you've had some interactions or lack of interactions with Murray Sinclair. I was wondering if you could just tell the audience a little bit about this controversy.
Well, the latest issue I had with Murray Sinclair happened in May of this year. I had just completed 6 years as chair of the Social Services Appeal Board for Manitoba. We deal with the social assistance issues. People bring their issues to our board when they're not happy with the way the government's treating them. Many of the people who came to my board were Indigenous people. But the point is, I did that job as chair for 6 years. We provided an annual report to the Manitoba legislature every year with my picture on there and my letter to the legislature and so on. The politicians in Winnipeg knew who I was and knew what I was doing. However, my term came to an end on May 10th. On May 27th, the leader of the Liberal Party in Manitoba, during question period in the House, complained about my reappointment, or not reappointment, but appointment to a new job, new position, that being a member of the King's Bench Masters Selection Committee. I mean, frankly, Francis, that's about a 1 hour a year job, okay? It's where you go over the different resumes and decide who's going to be a sort of a junior King's Bench judge. That was all it was. In any event, my name came up and I was appointed to that. This is after 6 years with the SSAB. So it's raised in the legislature. The next thing you know, I heard about this. The Free Press, Winnipeg Free Press, called me. Did you hear what Mr. Lamont, the leader of the Liberal Party, did or complained about you today? Yes, I did, and I'm not very happy because I think this is a judicial situation, and the law, justice must not only be done, but it must be seen to be done. So if this is the kind of feelings people have about me, I'm out of here. I've immediately phoned the minister and resigned. Next thing you know, the minister, my party's in power in Manitoba, the party I've supported for most of my life, been part of. And anyway, the minister apologized for appointing me. And of course, the CBC, where do they go? They ran off directly to Murray Sinclair. Murray Sinclair said, yes, anybody who questions the validity of the TRC report deserves no further public audience, and Jim McCrae is the worst of the denialists. After that, I actually felt pretty good that day because some of the issues I've been working on are now getting some attention.
Yes.
I immediately prepared a press release challenging Murray Sinclair to join me and a camera to defend some of his statements to the public. For example, in 2010, appearing officially in his role as chair of the TRC, he spoke to the UNN and said that for roughly 7 generations, nearly every Indigenous child in Canada was forced to attend residential school. That is simply not true, Francis. You know this. And the fact is that about 1/6 of status Indian kids attended those schools. 1/6, maybe 1/3 altogether of all Indigenous kids attended those schools. So I challenged Murray Sinclair to that a debate, or whatever you want to call it, on a camera in a television studio. He has been hiding from me ever since.
Yeah.
That's what happened. My history with Mr. Sinclair goes back to the 80s and 90s when I was Attorney General of Manitoba.
Yes.
The Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. I was the minister. Murray Sinclair and his colleague, Justice Hamilton, were doing this inquiry into the killing of J.J. Harper and Helen Betty Osborne, which is another thing I'd like to quickly refer to. That commission was set up in the middle of an election campaign, which the previous Howard Pauley government lost to us. We ended up, it was on my plate. The first thing that happened when I became Attorney General, I had to make arrangements for this inquiry into these matters. So I had the 2 judges in my office. I suggested, my understanding of inquiries is that there needs to be room for dissent should it arise. So, Your Honor and my Lord, what about the idea of having a 3rd commissioner? I think it was Murray Sinclair that looked at me. One of the two did, but both were there and said,
Mhm.
if you make any changes to the mandate or the makeup of this commission, you will regret it. Francis, my previous work was that of a court reporter. My job was to bow when judges entered courtrooms and to do
Mm,
everything that they said. I was brand new as the Attorney General, and
yeah.
both Gary Filman and I agreed that given the sensitivity of the issues involved, the death of Helen Betty Osborne and J.J. Harper, we ought not to dare to mess with it. So Murray, that's my history with Murray Sinclair. He goes back all those years, and that's why I was so astounded when he was appointed to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I knew Murray Sinclair was an activist. There's no way in the world you're going to get an unbiased report from anything Murray Sinclair is involved with. So that's
Yeah.
all I should say.
And the other two as well, like, this is the thing. And the Royal Commission, I think, Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which was actually the my doctoral dissertation was on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, so I'm very familiar with that exercise. I think that sort of started out this kind of thing, which is pretending to be some kind of academic
And
objective.
pretending to be independent and impartial, pretending.
Yes, when it's very politicized right from the get-go, and people are selected not because of their expertise that can be evaluated and discussed by everyone, but kind of representatives of particular political factions. That's generally what happens.
It's very similar to asking the community around Kamloops to be the lead investigators into what went on there or didn't go on there. I mean, since when do we ask the relatives or the so-called victims of an offense to be the investigators?
Yes, yes.
Which brings me to something that happened very recently in your neighborhood in Bragg Creek, which is quite near Calgary. The police are digging holes, and you know more about it than I do. But what occurred to me as interesting is that the police made the comment that this is a situation. This is the spokesperson for the police in the Bragg Creek excavation. This is a situation where we have information that's come to us that we believe is reliable, and we know there are families out there seeking answers. And we have a duty to help bring closure to the families. In this case, we are looking at all the avenues we have. We believe the information is credible, so we're going to do what we can. That's the police response to reliable information. What's the police response to information in the Kamloops situation? They don't do anything.
Well, according to, so this is so Jim and I are on this email discussion group, which often involves the researcher Nina Green, who is a very, very significant figure who actually brought together everyone over the last couple of years. Anyway, Nina has created this website called Residential School Records, I believe, and she was the one who dug this up about the investigation into Kamloops. So that would be what one would expect in the Kamloops case, is when you get an allegation that there are 215 burials in and not in a cemetery. These are in an apple orchard, so it never was a cemetery. Many of the other cases have to do with cemeteries, and as I think it was Sophie Pierre said, Indigenous leader, one shouldn't be expected, kind of surprised if you find remains in a cemetery, because that's what cemeteries are all about. Now, in terms of the identifiers and so on, the crosses that have blown away, these are matters that we can investigate to figure out who's buried there and so on. But it's not a matter of clandestine burials. And in the case of Kamloops, this is all about clandestine burials. And the police were going to investigate. But according to Nina Green, the information that Nina Green has dug up, excuse the pun, Murray Sinclair was involved in sort of questioning the RCMP and accusing them of being
Ham-handed.
ham-handed by wanting to talk to Sarah Beaulieu, who is the GPR expert who found these 215 anomalies on the GPR. So that his name comes up again in all these kinds of problematic situations that we're now faced with across the country. The Kamloops area is the most significant of all the various quote unquote discoveries. All eyes should be on Kamloops because that's what started us down this path. And people continuously bring up the Kamloops case as evidence for genocide. Because, of course, if you have a mass grave, which was originally announced, of 215 children, then you have some kind of mass killing that took place, which generally, most of the time when you have that happen, it's a evidence of genocide. So that's what got us going along this whole like confirmation of genocide is the Kamloops case. So we need much more attention to that. And Murray Sinclair, again, was one of the figures who was involved in obstructing any attempts to get at the truth with respect to this matter.
Well, and furthermore, Murray Sinclair is the person, the leader who everybody believes and respects. He's the person who told CBC's The Current radio program that 15,000 could be that 15,000 to 25,000 Indigenous children died as a result of their residential school experience. Absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever, Francis.
Yes.
In fact, we've had 4 or 5 excavations done. Mm-hmm. Not one murdered child has been recovered, unlike what former Chief Archibald said. She said that 1,600 innocent little murdered children had been recovered so far. These are leaders. These are people that people look up to and listen to. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, the media never even asks them any questions because they're so respected as leaders. I remember my experience as a minister. All I ever had to do was open my mouth, and I was bombarded with questions and cross-examination by media people. This never seems to happen with any of these allegations that are being made. And I have implored numerous CBC, especially journalists, to do something about asking questions. This is what journalists are supposed to do, I thought, but I guess I'm wrong about that.
Did you watch the Fifth Estate documentary on the Kamloops case?
Yes, I did.
So the Fifth Estate is supposedly the flagship investigative journalist program for CBC.
And that's the best they could do? Throw out a bunch of allegations with absolutely no evidence? I think
sit there and Gillian Finley, who I have quite a lot of respect for, like she's done a lot of good work. She just sat there and nodded her head when you had very, very allegations that were very strange, such as one Indigenous woman saying she was walking back from lunch and she turned her head and saw 4 boys hanging from a barn. So they were dead, I assume, and they had killed themselves, or I'm not sure what it was. Anyway, Gillian Finley just nodded her head and said, yeah, well, that's terrible. But
I think, Francis, you agree with me. I think I read it somewhere that you made the point that there is a sensitivity involved here because there were children who were abused, and there were negative aspects to the residential school system. When you take a tiny child and take it away from its family and so on, all of that, it's a very sensitive matter. But because it's so sensitive, most Canadians, you and I accepted, most Canadians are afraid to ask any questions. And now, especially when the government is threatening to make criminals out of people like us, but I respect the sensitivity, and I know you do too. It's just that if we're going to have reconciliation, and the word truth is always thrown in with it, well, let's talk about it. Murray Sinclair himself wrote to the Calgary Herald back in 2010 to say that there was a caring group of people involved in the education of these youngsters, and that these stories must also be told. Well, all I'm doing is telling the stories that Murray Sinclair says I should be telling, and yet somehow things have got off the rails pretty badly. So there's more. I wanted to take a minute to talk about the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation.
Yes.
Because it's sort of the successor to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Murray Sinclair is still involved with the NCTR. He's part of their circle of, I don't know what, but more than a year ago, you'll recall a few minutes ago, I mentioned Helen Betty Osborne. This really got me going when I was reviewing the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation Memorial Register of, and the NCTR advertises on its website that its memorial register is a list of children who died at or went missing from Indian residential schools. Helen Betty Osborne was murdered viciously in 1971 in Manitoba. And that murder was the subject of part of the work of Murray Sinclair and his colleague Alvin Hamilton back in the late 80s, early 90s. So I'm looking at all of these names on this memorial register, and out pops the name Helen Betty Osborne, who attended the Guy Hill School in Manitoba, near the Pas, Manitoba. The fact is, Helen Betty Osborne was already finished at Guy Hill. She was attending Margaret Barber High School in the Pas when she was murdered by 3 or 4 horrible people. Why would her name be amongst those who died at or went missing from a residential school? So with the help of the aforementioned Nina Green, I've been doing a lot of study on Library and Archives Canada documents. There are thousands and thousands of them, maybe millions. But looking at death certificates, official documents. Nina Green has found and shared the names of hundreds of kids whose deaths had nothing whatever to do with the schools. Many children might have been students at the time, or maybe not, but they died in house fires. They died in accidents. They died from gunshot wounds. They died in plane crashes, car accidents, train accidents. One kid named Bell died when a tree fell on him, hundreds of kilometers away from his school. These kids' names are all included on that register. I wrote to the NCTR about it. I got an answer, but I don't hear from them anymore, of course, but I got an answer. And the answer was an acknowledgement. And I'll give you the quote. Many children's names are included on that memorial list because families have asked for those names to be included so that their names could be included with the names of their schoolmates. This is not what that memorial register is supposed to be all about. The NCTR is funded by you and I, Francis, and other Canadians. There's no accountability with that group. I asked my member of parliament to meet with the NCTR about that very issue that I had written to them about. He agreed to do it. He invited me to join him. I said, well, I'd love to, but Larry, maybe you'd let NCTR know as a courtesy that I'm going to be part of the meeting. I was forbidden to attend with my member of parliament.
Yeah, unsafe space if you were there. So this is a very interesting area that our viewers might not know too much about. And I think we should look at this a little bit more as to what's going on here. So out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of the things that came out of that commission was the creation of the NCTR. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
And what is their mandate?
Well, their mandate will, you can see it on their website.
Okay.
It's really to be the repository of records, to work with Indigenous families to try to bring about healing, and that's worrisome because if they're going to be the only repository of information in the future, people like me will not be able to review the thousands and thousands of admissions, applications for admissions signed by parents so that their kids could go to the schools. In the future, if the NCTR gets its way, and Kimberly Murray, she has such a long title, I can't even remember it, but she's been hired by the government to look further into missing kids and whatnot. The point is that if the general public is not going to be able to access information about this, the narrative that we're currently trying to debunk remain the narrative. That's a problem, Francis.
But this missing, and this is the other thing, is that we constantly hear about the murdered and missing. Now this was Indigenous women that they're talking about initially. So women who are largely prostitutes who are killed and all these things, or women in communities who are killed by their partners, which is another murders that happened for Indigenous women. That's a separate issue. What we're dealing with is the residential school students, and it's claimed, I believe, that there are thousands of missing children, and it's implied that they were murdered and buried in clandestine graves. Is this correct?
That's the implication, Francis, but nobody has given us a name of a, quote, missing child. Nobody, no family that we know of has ever reported a missing child. We've got to be so careful about the word missing, because it's conflated with murder and all these other things. But yet we have no evidence of one murder at a residential school.
And so I assume that missing means that there's people buried, students buried in cemeteries where it's not known who's buried there. Is this what I think this is what is actually the issue here. Is that correct?
I don't know how to answer that, because of course there are graves across our country of people, Indigenous and everybody else, that have long ago been wiped out through nature or whatever, or record keeping. I don't know all the reasons, but there are plenty of people buried across our country for thousands of years, basically, and we don't know who they are. And so I think if we actually do excavate somewhere and find a body, that will certainly help the current narrative. However, what truth does it bring to us if we don't know who the person is? We don't know who was wondering where they are. Those things, it's so easy to put things into little bullets and say things that alarm and sensationalize people. And I'm very worried about what young people are being told in our schools about these matters.
Yeah. So, and I think that there's a lot of things being put together, so conflated, when we sort of need to pull apart these different kinds of claims that are being made. And this idea that there's some children that people are looking for, like the bodies of children, or children disappeared. I guess that's it. So the 4 boys, for example, that this Indigenous woman was mentioning in the Fifth Estate program. So she claims that she saw these 4 boys who were hanging from a barn. If you were an investigative journalist like Gillian Findlay, who was listening to that question, that would make you think and think, okay, well, who were those 4 boys? And they presumably were residential school students, or maybe not, or like let's go in and do some more investigation to find out about this. But
It's not.
instead, we just have this kind of feeling that there's all these children that died under mysterious circumstances. It's implied that they were killed by residential school priests and all sorts of other officials. Like, that's kind of the claim that we're sort of being expected to accept.
It is not at all disrespectful to ask questions when the whole story has not been told. I mean, we're dealing with allegations of the deaths of children. Surely, to goodness, questions need to be asked. And yet, somehow, those who do ask any kind of questions about any part of this narrative are being shamed. There's a name that has been invented for people like us that I don't even like repeating it because it's not true. Francis, my mother worked weekends at an Indian residential school as a supervisor. My little sister went with my mother to work, made friends with the children there.
Yeah.
This is part of my background with Indigenous people in Canada, even though I didn't know those kids. My sister did. They came over for sleepovers. Life was life.
Yeah.
But when somebody makes a claim like that, I mean, we'll leave Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip out of it because that's been debunked pretty well. But the one where they were alleged to have kidnapped a bunch of kids.
Yes.
It's respectful to want to get to the bottom of these things. That's my take. I'm not trying to harm anybody. I want a better life for ordinary Indigenous people for the future. And if we're not going to get there, I promise you, we're not going to get there if we continue to hide the truth.
Well, it seems that this word truth means different things to different people. And this actually was, there's a really good book by Ronald Neetzen, I believe his name is. He's an academic. He wrote a book called Truth and Indignation. And he has a section in there talking about truth, and the truth that a number of Indigenous spokespeople were arguing for, what they mean by it, is what's referred to as relative truth. So that is the truth that they believe, what they believe to be true, which of course is different than how truth is defined in popular discourse, which is truth is something that is an objective thing that we're all trying to together understand. So in the case of the residential schools, what we're arguing for is that we're trying to develop an objective understanding of what happened there. And this is very contentious. It's totally understandable, because some of the records are missing. And so we don't know the whole story, but we want to try to piece that together with what we have and kind of try and connect the dots. But this is being thwarted at every turn by people like Murray Sinclair, who have this idea of relative truth, which is that whatever a knowledge keeper believes should be respected and accepted, because otherwise you're obviously a residential school denialist, what's called a residential school denialist, which is not denying that the residential schools existed. It is denying that the residential schools were genocidal. That's what residential school denialist is. And it's being compared to Holocaust denial. So everyone who is generally is an academic and has an understanding of history understands that there were millions of people killed, deliberately killed, in the Holocaust. And if you deny that millions of people were deliberately killed, then you would be considered to be a Holocaust denier. And now they're saying that if you deny that, I guess, thousands of Indigenous people were deliberately killed in the residential schools, you're a residential school denialist, I think is what's being attempted. Like that, the kind of the inference.
You use the word objective truth.
Mhm.
How can you have objective truth when we're entertaining his truth, her truth, their truth?
Yes,
Where does the truth come into it?
yes.
This to me is a change from previous history that I'm aware of. I don't know where this just believe them comes from, and maybe you'll talk about that when I start asking you questions.
Wokeism.
Okay, we're going to get there. I know that.
Wokeism.
But
So,
you know,
Jim,
the excavations that have been conducted thus far, which have uncovered no bodies, what does that say about the infallibility, Francis, of the knowledge keepers, the elders, those who were believed?
yeah.
What am I supposed to believe them now? Now that what they've told us is not true?
This is the problem with oral histories, and oral histories are unreliable. And that doesn't mean that there isn't perhaps some information that's useful from them, but you need to approach them with a degree of skepticism about the fact that memories are not like you have a disc in your head that you can just pull out and then replay it, and it's exactly the same as existed at the time that you were remembering things. What happens with memory is that depending upon your own personality, so some people have better memories than others due to their own way they approach, looking at things in the past, but also the emotional circumstances in which you're recalling the memory is very, very important too. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with those hearings that they held, with everyone crying and everyone hearing everyone, this is just an environment that is not conducive to remembering things accurately. And that has to be something that's considered. But that's not really what the Truth and Reconciliation was all about. It wasn't about accurately remembering things. It was about allowing people to vent and express their pain and everything like that they felt, which is, one can argue that that's kind of a therapeutic thing, which is very, very important for people to do. But that's a very different type of thing than trying to build some kind of accurate understanding of history on. And we have all these different kinds of things which we're trying to do, but we don't clearly specify what exactly is the purpose of what we're doing. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is pretending to be an academic forum that provides us with a better understanding of what happened. That's not what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is about at all. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was about giving a voice to Indigenous people who attended residential schools who felt that they had been silenced in the past and not being able to put forward their particular perspective.
That is the same system used by Murray Sinclair and his colleague for the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba. Open forum, say what you
Yes.
want.
Yes.
And one last thing before my hour is up. I've been accused of saying that the people who spoke to the TRC were lying. And I choose not to say that they were lying, that anyone was lying. But I'll give you one quick example. My little sister and I, she's 4 years younger than me, that's how little she is, we were sitting at my kitchen table talking about events that went on in our family many years ago, describing one particular event. We both had very different versions of that event. This is the way humans are, Francis.
Yeah. No.
I have a lot of respect for people who were hurt by their experience at the schools. I want to be sensitive to the negative parts of the history of the schools, but I'm also mindful that the future demands that we all understand what happened. It was certainly not genocide. We know that, and maybe we'll ask you some things about that in a few minutes. It
Yes.
was certainly not genocide. It wasn't pretty, but the question that nobody's ever answered me: what should have been done?
Yes.
All we know how to do is criticize what was done, but nobody wants to talk about what should have been done. I
Yes.
think my hour is up.
Your hour is up, Jim.
You're the next victim,
Oh,
Francis.
yep. So the screens are turned, and now you can ask me anything you want except about my situation with Mount Royal, because that is currently in arbitration and therefore is something that cannot be talked about. But everything else is on the table.
Francis, can I talk about the charter challenge that,
Oh,
that
yes.
you've
Yes,
been involved in?
definitely. Yes.
Is that over with, or what's the score
No,
with
no,
that?
no. So that is going to be going forward in 2025. I believe it's
Oh, I
February.
see.
Yeah,
I
so
see.
that's but what we want to do, so the charter challenge is being brought by Paul Viminitz, myself, and Jonah Pickle, who's a student. So Paul Viminitz is a philosophy professor from the University of Lethbridge. He invited me to speak on the topic of how wokeism threatens academic freedom, ironically. And when some activists, largely Indigenous activists, but probably other issues were involved as well, heard that I was going to be speaking, they put pressure on the president. And then the president initially said that although he didn't think my values aligned with the University of Lethbridge, whatever those values are, he recognized that University of Lethbridge had a free speech policy based on the Chicago principles, and therefore, which allows offensive views to be aired. Anyway, because of the free speech policy, I would be allowed to speak. Then more pressure was placed upon him, and he caved to the pressure and said that that because of this concerns about emotional safety and harm, that I would not be allowed to speak, or sorry, that space would not be given to me to speak, was basically what happened. And then I was asked by Paul what I wanted to do about this, whether I wanted to have a Zoom talk and so on. And I said, well, I certainly want to give a Zoom talk, but I think it's very important that I go to the campus and assert my presence on campus and not be pushed out. And I'll do a speaker's format type of talk, just in a public space, and anyone can come and hear me. And when I showed up to give my talk on February 1st, I was greeted by about 700 people. Not all of them opposed to me speaking, but a few hundred of them very opposed to me speaking, with all sorts of signs saying hate speech is not academic freedom and so on. Anyway, they shouted me down and they wouldn't allow me to speak at all. And then security started to get a bit concerned because of the crowd. And I wasn't feeling threatened there. I thought it was very theatrical. I didn't think they were serious at all. I thought they were spoiled brats and they were just trying to get their way. But because security was getting a bit antsy, I decided that it would be best if I left. And so that's basically the situation. And then what happens now is, because my freedom of expression rights were violated, Paul Viminitz, actually his academic freedom rights were violated, because he had decided that I should give the talk, and he was denied resources to have a talk go forward that he wanted to organize. And Jonah Pickle, who wanted to listen to the talk, which is a very important aspect of freedom of expression. It's not just your right to speak, it is your right to hear things and make a decision for yourself. Because of that, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms is mounting a charter challenge against the University of Lethbridge, which is going to go ahead in 2025. But what we want to do is have events every few months in different universities, different libraries, and so on, having a debate on whether wokeism does threaten academic freedom or not. hopefully with people who are supporters of this kind of censorship that's going on for whatever reasons that they have, so that we can then have a kind of a discussion about the matter. So we have a talk coming up at the the Lethbridge Public Library on September 16th with Paul Viminitz, myself, and Jonah Pickle. I've invited 6 people so far from the University of Lethbridge to come and argue the opposite, that wokeism does not threaten academic freedom, but they so far have not answered any of my inquiries about the matter.
I can understand. I don't know if you're frustrated, but I am, that so many people to whom of whom I ask questions, they simply ignore me. It
Yes.
just strikes me, if they have such a good case, why don't they want to answer my questions? But my question to you is, can you just expand a little about this whole business of wokeism being anti-wokeism being seen as hate speech? How do those two equate?
So first of all, wokeism, which is I never used the term wokeism for many years because I see it as a very kind of colloquial term that is often used just to denounce people as being woke.
Kind of a buzzword for some.
Yeah, so, but because it's been adopted in so many different contexts, and it's got a bit of a catchy kind of, it's short, right? So I've just kind of, I've gone with it, and I write things now on the Woke Academy and things like this. Anyway, wokeism is identity politics that has become totalitarian. So, and this was brought about by a turn in the universities in the 1960s. And this is what we were getting at a few minutes ago in terms of this kind of idea of objective truth versus subjective truth that we were talking about. Postmodernism was a rejection of objective truth and the argument that subjectivity should take precedence, or subjectivity was really what everything is about. And if you claim that you are searching for an objective truth, that's some kind of power ploy, which is being used to maintain your position of privilege within the system. So you should be suspicious of anyone who according to postmodernism, makes a claim about objective truth and searching for truth. Anyway, this kind of turn that happened in the universities in the 60s then allowed these identity politics types of programs to gain a foothold in the institution in programs like Black studies and ethnic studies, which were then followed by women's studies and then disability studies, and the worst of them all, queer studies. So queer studies is the most advocacy oriented and identity politics oriented of all these programs. They just took up a position and they were allowed in, which was a big mistake. And once they got allowed in, and the identity politics is what they're about, which is the idea that overcoming oppression requires people to accept an oppressed identity's view of themselves. So if you want to have a more equal society, if you want to deal with all these problems that we see, for example, with Indigenous people, the way to do that is to accept Indigenous people's view of the way things are. And then this will empower these groups. And because they're empowered, then now they'll be able to fight against the oppression that they're facing. So this was all happening in universities in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, but it took up a very small part of the institution. In 2000s, this is when administrators started to court these programs and develop administrative structures that assumed that kind of approach. And then starting in about 2010, they took over the entire machinery of universities, and now administrators openly use these kind of identity politics types of programs to basically intimidate and silence professors and students who think the university should be about open inquiry and the pursuit of truth, academic freedom, and critical thinking. So this has now totally been taken over.
That's a little bit about what the Charter Challenge is all about.
Yeah, so the Charter Challenge is about how the University of Lethbridge violated freedom of expression because it is a woke university. So, so my talk, ironically, was on how wokeism threatens academic freedom. Well, because University of Lethbridge is a woke university and has allowed identity politics to take over the machinery of that institution, there is no more open inquiry, freedom of expression, academic freedom at that institution. That is now gone at that institution.
I wanted to get your sense of something. I'm a layperson. I don't have a PhD or anything like that, but it bothers me that some people promote themselves as scholars and academics, but my perception of them is that they're simply, and above all else, activists.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit for me? How are we supposed to? I'm not going to name names, but there are people in Manitoba who teach at our university in Manitoba and claim to be scholars, claim to be academics.
Yeah.
Yet all they ever do is advocate.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that for a minute?
Well, I'll name names on the residential school file. 3 loom large. Negan Sinclair, who is the son of
I happen to know Nigan. Yes, right.
Sean Carlton, who is a professor at University of Manitoba, same university Negan Sinclair is at, and Keisha Supernon, who is a professor at the University of Alberta.
U of M is where the NCTR is housed.
Yes, and there's another University of Manitoba. All eyes on the University of Manitoba. So University of Manitoba has some answering to do because I believe they are sort of the authorizing entity for the NCTR. I'm not sure.
I think they're the employer of all the people at NCTR. Correct me.
They are a publicly funded educational institution. So they should have the NCTR running just like a proper archives runs. So archives are very, very important. And I don't quite know why we have the NCTR at all when it should really be the National Archives of Canada that is the entity. They're the ones who have expertise in archival kinds of records. And
but they're the same people. They're the same people, though, pushing for document sovereignty. I think they call it.
Yes, data sovereignty.
Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
I might have cut you off. I'm sorry, Francis.
Yeah, data sovereignty is the words that are used, but data sovereignty is a anti-scholarly approach to records. So whenever you have archives, and I've talked to some archivists about this, there's a science to it. You want to keep all the records in, I think it's called in place, like you don't lift out those records out of where they came from. You keep them where they are. So and I was listening to this with respect to archives in I think it was with respect to the death squads in Central America. Is the tendency was to kind of lift out all the things and then arrange them in chronological order, right? You never do things like that with archival, because everything must stay within its own context. So if you have health records, for example, you don't take a health record out and put it with a bunch of other records, and then because now we're not sure what other records were there alongside those other, you got to preserve how that was found and not reorganize.
Fix the context out when you do that.
Because that means that you can't trust that record anymore because there could be other parts to it that are now missing and like this sort of thing. Anyway, what's happening with the NCTR is it's a politicized repository. So it wants to have a particular narrative be disseminated, and it's going to shape the records to suit that purpose. And the narrative that it wants is that Canada is a genocidal country, and all these kinds of murders and everything were orchestrated against Indigenous people. Intentional extermination was orchestrated against them. And this, of course, is part of the whole Aboriginal industry that has been going on since the white paper, whereby reparations and transfers can be extracted. So the more you can ratchet up the crimes that have been committed, the more money can be extracted by lawyers as reparations and compensation of various kinds. And that's the nature of Indigenous politics. And unfortunately, because it's so powerful now, the Aboriginal industry, it's taken over all these things. And with respect to these three scholar activists, so like a scholar activist is a oxymoron, because if you are a scholar, you might be able to be an activist yourself, but your scholarship, the idea is to keep your activism out of your scholarship, because if you allow your activism to intrude on your scholarship, that means that your scholarship will be shaped to take a particular position that's going to enhance your activist goals, and that could go against scholarly standards of various kinds. So activism and scholarship need to be kept separate. You can still be an activist, but you've got to be the activist in separation from your scholarly activities. Anyway, Negan Sinclair, Sean Carlton, and Keisha Supernon are pretending to be scholars when actually activism is their main kind of goal, and they're everything that colors whatever they do. And so people like Sean Carlton, who's the worst of all of them, he will boast that he will never listen to the perspective that's different from his own, because that will give that perspective legitimacy in his view. So of course that means
is that a scholarly approach?
A scholarly approach is you need to consider all the information that's there. So you never exclude any information. Now you allow all that information in, and then you use recognized approaches to sift through that information and determine what is valid, what is the most valid kind of conclusions to reach on this basis. And so
I think we understand pretty well, but you and I, but when somebody is billed as an academic and a scholar, and then they're allowed to espouse activist ideas, is that fair to the general public who is hearing all this stuff?
It destroys the universities. So, and we've now have a huge problem in universities because there's been a hiring push at a number of universities because you have retirement. So a whole bunch of white males, old white males, which was not necessarily because they were selected on that basis. It just
I'm sorry, Francis. I apologize for being an old white male.
People like you, Jim. So people like you, Jim, a whole bunch of people that look like you, Jim, are retiring, who had the old school kind of approach, the scholarly approach to how to do things, which is what a university is all about. Now, you could argue that, there was some discrimination that went on that prevented women and people of color and so on from being part of the university. Okay, fine. So that's all been, all those kind of discriminatory sorts of things have been dealt with. But now we are actively hiring people on the basis of their identity characteristics and their support for what's called diversity, inclusion, and equity. And you actually have to write statements about this now. So if you're, applying on jobs, you have to, sort of signal your affinity towards this kind of postmodern kind of viewpoint that the identities of people must be affirmed and their view of themselves must be accepted without question, these sorts of things. Anyway, a large number of the new cohort is people who are like this, professors who are like this, that are taking up these positions. So the whole kind of flavor of the university has been dramatically changed over the last 10 years. And those people now are going to have positions of power within the institution. So it's going to be a very, very difficult process to try to get universities back to being academic institutions. This is a huge battle that's got to be fought. And unfortunately, university professors have not been very good at communicating the importance of universities to the general public. And universities are incredibly important institutions because they, first of all, the knowledge that comes out, like much of the knowledge that we have in society comes from universities. And if you have a bunch of woke people who are doing the research, the knowledge is going to be completely contaminated. Secondly, there's huge problems now in things like the legal profession and teaching and medical schools and so on. So professionals need to have their training and everything has to be based on the best possible evidence that's out there. And there's all sorts of problems with that. So you're going to have very low quality professionals who are coming out of the institution. And then finally, universities are the last bastion, like they're a bulwark against authoritarianism, because you used to have situations where you had a number of people who could speak the truth without fear of losing their job, right? And I did it for 20 years. I was totally, I was naive, and I thought that that was my job, was if I heard something that I didn't think made sense, I would question that. And that is not allowed anymore. So you have a whole bunch of professors now who are completely afraid and intimidated and will say nothing in opposition to very, very irrational ideas that are being put forward, such as the Kamloops case. So the Kamloops case is a really good example of this, is that the Kamloops case is an unbelievable hysteria that has no basis in fact at all. Yet everyone is afraid, any professor is afraid to question that case, because if you do, you're going to get hit. You're going to get hit very hard.
Going to get McMurtry'd.
Yeah, so Jim McMurtry, who was a teacher who got fired because he was trying to explain to some students about how tuberculosis was, like there's many children who died at residential schools. No one's denying that. What we're denying is that those children were murdered. There's no evidence of murder that exists. So children died from tuberculosis. There was, poor conditions in schools. So ventilation was poor. Often you didn't have the highest quality food and everything that people were eating and so on. Resources were very scarce and were not, there were not enough resources and so on. Things were, offloaded to the churches, which didn't allow very much oversight and so on. These are all problems. So no one's denying that. Jim McMurtry was just saying that most of the children died from disease, and then he gets fired because he's being insensitive and he's not, I don't even, the whole thing is just totally incomprehensible that would happen. But unfortunately, teachers don't have academic freedom. So that is, maybe they should, but professors have academic freedom so that professors can say these things without fear of being fired.
Apparently not anymore.
But what happens is that we now have, whole universities putting out statements that, that children's bodies were found at Kamloops, and they're still on university websites. Like, you've alerted them to the fact that they have false information on their website under the, the president of the university has put this out saying this. So shouldn't they at least take those things down from the websites? And at the University of Lethbridge, the Dean of Arts sent out an email to everyone in the Faculty of Arts saying, talking about all the murdered children and these sorts of things. So this is what is happening in universities. Professors are too afraid to challenge it because they know their careers, they'll suffer. Their careers will suffer if they do it. They might not get fired, but their career is going to suffer. And then you have all these opportunists who are just going along, they're encouraging this so that they can rise up the ladder and have powerful positions within the institution.
I want to ask you about presentism. When I tell my grandchildren about the rotary dial phone, or if I tell my grandchildren about my father's school experience, which was a one-room, drafty little wooden building with no running water and no plumbing or any of those things, they look at me funny as if, really? Well, they're being invited to look at similar situations at the Indian residential schools, only in the very early years when they were drafty buildings like everywhere else and so on. But they're applying their lifestyle today and using that to feel bad. Don't get me wrong, we should have some concerns about what did go on, but they're not able to look at the experience of the native kids and compare it with the experience of rural Canadian kids like that of my father. How can we talk to young people and invite them to stop with the 2020 vision looking backwards business and think about the context within which those schools were operating all those years? How can we do this successfully, do you think?
Well, the museums could play a role in this.
Will they?
The educational system, like the K-12 system, should be doing this as well.
Are they?
Oh no, like no one is really thinking about the truth. This is a big problem, and I think Terry Glavin. So Terry Glavin, when he was writing his piece on the Year of the Graves for the National Post, which I thought was a very mild piece, and was far too lenient on the Kamloops leadership, the Kamloops band leadership, which was right in there in terms of controlling the information and so on. So and making claims about genocide and so on. But still, he did put a critical lens on what had been happening over the past since starting in 2021, and was castigated. Was had all this people making all sorts of accusations about him. And everyone else looked at that, of course, and said, do we really want to have that happen to us? So we'll stay out of it. But he did this interesting interview with the National Post. It was on their kind of podcast. And he said, we no longer just don't care about the truth. We don't care that we don't care about the truth. Like yes, this is how bad it is that if we don't care about the truth, our society's over. Like that is what the Enlightenment is about. That's our society is founded on the Enlightenment principles, which are about how we as individuals can come together and reason, and we don't have to rely on the king, and we don't have to rely on the church. We can decide for ourselves, and we can really become self-actualizing human beings in terms of this kind of whole hierarchy of needs kind of idea. We can pursue that through our minds, and we can do this. If we don't care about the truth, that's over. And this whole presentism that you're talking about, part of that is that people just don't care anymore. So we should be trying to understand things from all the different angles. And part of that is trying to put ourselves in the conditions that existed, in the case of the residential schools, when it was starting in 1867 or whenever this was begun, and the kinds of challenges that were in place then, things like transportation. So everyone now just assumes, you get in your car and you go somewhere, you get in a plane, you go, travel is not a big deal here. And getting things from one place to another is not a big deal. But 150 years ago, getting supplies from one area to another was a huge logistical problem. And so obviously you're going to have quite a lot of scarcity that exists in those kinds of circumstances. Things are not going to work very well, because trying to fix things and trying to organize things is not an easy task. So that's the kind of thing that needs to be thought about when all these people are castigating the people who went and for whatever reason were trying to start up this school system, which was not an easy task at all.
What you said really disturbs me, Francis, and certainly not in a debate context. You said that people simply don't care anymore.
Yeah.
That's the most depressing thing you can say. I'm not after you for saying it. I'm sorry that it seems to be true. If we don't care anymore about what we're hearing, could we not please care a little bit about the future of who are today's young Indigenous people? They're being told by their leaders, people they respect, that their history is god awful, that white people have abused them for centuries, that their ancestors were murdered in their tens of thousands. This is what young Indigenous kids are learning today. How does that bode for the future relationship between them, their children, and my grandchildren and their children?
Yeah.
This is the bottom line of why I do what I do, Francis.
Yeah.
I'm very worried about them. Sure, I'm worried about how that's going to affect the colonial system that we've developed over the years. Yes, I support our colonial system, and I'll say that loud and clear. But the fact is, it's the colonial system that has developed everything that you and I enjoy, but also those Indigenous people who can enjoy anything, they get to enjoy those things too, including education and whatnot. But why can't we care more about the future of today's young Indigenous people? Is that a question you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, there's a couple of things that come out of your question. One is the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, which I think is, seriously undermined by all this, what is called parallelism in the literature, which is the encouragement that Indigenous people should be on a separate path from non-Indigenous people. And after the white paper, the idea, the idea of integration and bringing Indigenous people in to the modern society, that was always the goal up until the white paper, was to do that. Now it was botched and there was very insensitive and so on, right? So there were mistakes that were made, but it was still that was the approach. And then after the white paper failed, more and more the Aboriginal industry took hold, and then the idea that there should be a separate path for Indigenous people was proposed, and that was never going to have any benefit at all. That it was based upon a complete misunderstanding of Indigenous societies and the hunting and gathering cultures of which they came out of, and how those 630 small isolated groups without any economic base, those are not going to be able to enter into a nation to nation relationship with non-Indigenous society or Canadian society, like the actual mainstream. So that it was based on a flawed understanding, and now we're going ahead as if this is actually reality, and pretending that somehow these small isolated groupings are going to be able to have their own educational systems and their own health systems and so on. And I hate to think, I haven't done any research on Indigenous communities, these isolated communities. And I think it's like 75% of Indigenous communities have fewer than 500 people. I believe that's what this was.
A lot of them. I can't tell you the numbers.
A lot. It's a majority. It's the majority that are very small and isolated. Those places, the conditions in those places are absolutely horrendous. And you can get a glimpse of it from time to time. That the hopelessness and the despair, which is not surprising at all. If you can't see how your life is going to fit in with what's happening within the world, like, so, and that's the thing, is that Canada is a country, but Canada is a country with a whole bunch of other countries in the world, and we understand like different places and how we fit in, like you were involved in being a cabinet minister and a citizenship judge and so on. You could see the effects that your role was having on other people, and it meant something. If you didn't do your job that day, that meant that something wouldn't get done, and it would be a problem, right? Same thing when I was a professor. If I didn't go in and teach my classes, there would be problems. I couldn't just not do anything. And although it's a responsibility that you have to do that, it also means that you matter, that what you do matters. In these small isolated communities where people have no economic kind of reason for existing, their life doesn't matter. And they know it. You can lie to them all you want, but if they are not being productive members of society and producing things that other people need, they will have a sense of hopelessness that exists. And that's what exists in these communities. And what we have now, although this is not known because it's such a sensitive area of research, we have very high levels of fetal alcohol syndrome in these communities. And that is not something that can be rectified. This is going to be permanently damaged segments of the Indigenous population, and that needs a concerted state of emergency response, not shoveling money out of the back of a pickup truck to Indigenous neo-tribal elites who are then going to just, fritter it away on whatever for their own personal gain, and not having any of the services that are necessary to deal with these state of emergency situations. So in answer to your question, I think that there are problems for Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations in terms of being able to cooperate and being able to do things to solve problems. But then there's the actual on the ground conditions, which we don't know very much about because it's being hidden. Because if it were known, it would be just it would be a horrifying situation to look at.
Well, it's because I have seen some of those conditions
Yes.
in many Manitoba reserved communities. Because of that, I'm not going to give up, because
Yeah.
if I can make even a tiny bit of progress with your help and that of some of our colleagues, Francis,
Yes. Yeah.
that's what we need to do. The trouble is that our efforts are being deliberately misunderstood.
Yes.
And because in the case of one of the so-called scholars that you referred to, the reason we do what we do is to protect our colonial way of life, and that, so that we can profit from it. This is gobbledygook as far as I'm concerned. It's just silly talk. If people could understand, and I try in most of the things I write to make the point that, how is this helping Indigenous families, sort of question that I like to ask, because I want it to be clear. You can call me all the names you want. The point is, Indigenous people are not doing better as a result of shoveling all these dollars into their chiefs' pockets.
Yes.
And then not asking for any results. When Mr. Trudeau offers to spend $320 million on ground penetrating research, which so far has yielded nothing, does he ever ask, what did you do with the money I gave you? This. What did Mr. Trudeau and his government say when former Grand Chief Archibald, was complaining about lack of accountability, about corruption, about cronyism? It didn't take Mr. Trudeau very long to go after the hockey people for their misdeeds. But here we have the Grand Chief of all the Indians and status Indians in Canada complaining publicly about how horrible her organization is.
Yeah.
Does our Prime Minister say, we're going to hold back some of your financing until you get this under control? That didn't happen. Our Prime Minister is what they used to call a yes man to anything. I can't remember when he has said no to any demand made by the chiefs. Do you know of any instances where Mr. Trudeau Jr. has said no?
Well, this is the idea of parallelism, though. So, we have two possible visions for Canada. One is this parallelist nation to nation type of understanding, which is that Indigenous people are going to be traveling on a separate path, and they are going to be the ones making the determination about how they're going to operate in the world. And this is going to require, because of the history of colonialism, billions and billions of dollars to be dispersed every year, but they're going to be the ones to decide how those billions of dollars are going to be spent, because that is going to enable them to make sure that money is spent in a way that is consistent with their culture and so on. So that is the parallelist position. And if you assume that position, to have any kind of criticism is illegitimate right from the start, because it assumes that a non-Indigenous government can make decisions about what things should be like in Indigenous communities. And because of an acceptance of parallelism, that's just illegitimate right off the bat, because that government is not Indigenous, it by its nature cannot understand what it is that Indigenous people really need, and what kinds of programs and services should be in place. So
Indigenous led has a really nice ring to it, Francis.
yes.
But ordinary Canadians who pay their taxes and work hard and all the rest of it, are they ever going to wake up and say, well, what does Indigenous led mean? Does it mean we've lost, as taxpayers, control over every nickel? Is that what it means? Well, it already means that, in my opinion.
Yes. And that's what it's argued, that this is good.
How long should this be allowed to go on, though? Before
what is it? As long as the rivers run and the rivers flow, and like this is the quote unquote treaty relationship. As long as the sun shines and the rivers flow, which it's never going to work. it's not based upon a rational understanding of history and the difference in development. And this is what is behind all of the difficulties in talking about this subject, is that cultures that come out of a hunting and gathering mode of production, which is much less productive, are much less developed than modern nation states, which are based upon thousands of years of economic, political, and intellectual progress.
Technological as well.
Technology. You had Stone Age technology in hunting and gathering societies, very, very low level of productivity, not a very advanced understanding of the nature of the universe at all. Everything was seen as being determined by spiritual forces and so on. Politics, which you've mentioned a number of times, is based on kinship in hunting and gathering societies. So that means you go into politics so that you can get things for your relatives, and you're going to favor your relatives over non-relatives. That's the nature of it. In modern society, with operates according to legal rational principles, that is nepotism and corruption. If you have a government official that is using their position to provide resources to their family and friends, that's corruption. But that's not corruption in Indigenous communities. That's tribal politics, and that's the way things work. So if we're going to accept Indigenous culture as the basis for what goes on in Indigenous communities, and that's a good thing, then we should not be complaining about, relatives favoring one another, and the fact that people can't read and write properly and don't understand the scientific method at all, and so on. Like, that is modern societal principles. That is not hunting and gathering tribal principles. So we need to be honest about this, and we're not being honest. And because of this, we don't have a good understanding of things. And then people are continuously being frustrated about the fact that things are not working properly. But of course, they're not going to work properly, because we're expecting hunting and gathering cultural features to operate in a modern industrial nation that's part of a global, and it's not just Canada and Western societies. Any society that wants to participate in the global system, you've got to adopt modern principles, or it's not going to work properly. And that's the kind of problems that we're dealing with. But because we got scholar activists who are controlling all the discussions that go on and accusing everyone of racism and colonialism and denialism and all these accusations, everyone is not feeling free to discuss things. And now with the government wanting to criminalize honest discussions like that, now we're entering into another very, very serious and dangerous phase of Canadian history to have this happen. Fortunately, not happening yet, and hopefully enough people are, who are understand things are going to be opposed to it. But the fact that it hasn't gotten more pushback than it's happened is kind of a bit of a worrying thing as well.
It's not a question so much as a comment. Our Prime Minister, in a different context, is quoted as saying, "A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian." You may recall that and the context. Put that into an overall context. And it was Mr. Trudeau who said it. Yeah. I would like everyone, I invite everyone to start embracing the idea that a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. I know it's not going to happen, but that's how I feel. That's the way I wish all Canadians would feel. Indigenous Canadians have their history, but it's over 500 years with the rest of us. And I'm saying, why should my grandchildren have to suffer any further and get to the point where they don't even care anymore, as you pointed out? That's a very, very sad statement about our country. Agreed?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by Canadian, I guess. So, Canadian is the kind of view that we probably share about it is we all are equal under the law. So
I'm still there. I'm stuck on that.
no one is above the law, which was a principle that was fought for 800 years, so that we could wrest control away from the king and be individuals who would not be subjected to arbitrary punishment. So that is very important principle that is now under attack, seriously under attack, because the woke argue that due process is somehow part of white supremacy culture and keeps the powerful in place, and we have to rejig all the legal system so that those who are currently at the bottom of the hierarchy will have more legal powers and be able to overcome their position at the bottom of the hierarchy so that we can invert that hierarchy. What they don't understand is that by getting rid of the principle of due process and equality under the law, that will allow autocratic elements to take over the system. So what's happening is that there are authoritarians who are using the plight of people like Indigenous people and so on to argue for dismantling of the legal protections. And that will then allow them to seize power in the system.
Dangerous.
And that is really what's happened in totalitarian regimes historically, and that is what is going on right now. And people have to wake up. They don't care, and they're just going to go and live their life and keep their head down. Well, like, and it's Leon Trotsky who said this: you may not want to have a lot to do with war, but war wants to have a lot to do with you. And this is the same kind of thing we're talking about, is that we have to wake up, understand the danger, because what happens in these kind of totalitarian kinds of movements is that freedom of expression is the first thing to go. So like that's what is clamped down upon. And so we need to fight now to restore those rights, because we don't fight now, people will be in jail soon. And then
Well, I commend you, Francis, for the fight that you have undertaken thus far, and I do hope that you continue and not lose your courage, which you have shown in abundance. I want, because we're running out of time already.
Yes, we got about 5 minutes left.
I'm going to make a statement, then I'll ask you to make one.
Okay.
I am a lifelong conservative with a
Yeah.
small c since last October 27th. I have explained to the leader of the Federal Conservative Party that I understand that politics requires give and take, and that there's more than one issue to be dealing with. But calling my country, sitting on your hands while my country is called a genocide state, crosses the line. There are so many things involved in such a statement, and so many downstream results from such a statement, that it's too fundamental for anyone like me to be accused of a one-issue person. I've been through thick and thin with Tories, provincial and federal, over more than 50 years, but today I have no party. Tell me about your situation, Francis.
So I'm a socialist, historical materialist. So I'm not an activist. I'm a scholar. So I look at things scientifically, and I think that historical materialism, which is sort of the theory behind Marxism, I guess, if it cannot withstand scrutiny and evidence, it should be thrown out, just like other theories. And the person who I model my own thoughts on the most is George Orwell. And George Orwell was a socialist. Many people don't know that. but he also understood how socialist movements can be corrupted by the leadership, and then that freedoms, human freedom, can be seriously curtailed under sort of the auspices of socialism. So that's what I really think is very, very important now. And for me, I'm very interested in all sorts of discussions about, left-wing politics and so on. But I'm just putting a sidebar, I'm just putting that on hold, because we are now at a stage in Canadian history where we cannot have those discussions anymore. Those discussions, you cannot talk honestly about socialism or historical materialism or anything, because you are going to tread on forbidden zones. And when you do that, you will be attacked, and there will be a concerted effort to have you lose your livelihood, first of all, and then now with the government now, criminalizing various forms of speech, you will be put in jail at some point as well. So, people, I realize you're a conservative, and for me, that's really not relevant. My question is that, do you think that people should be able to state the truth as they see it in Canadian society? And if people think that you should be able to state the truth as you see it, regardless of what you say, then that's the coalition that we need to build right now to fight back against the terrible restrictions that are being mounted against the ability of Canadians to have these kinds of discussions, to help us to figure out whether socialism or conservatism or liberalism or whatever the different ideological kind of takes are, whether which one is the most valid of all those approaches to trying to create a better world for everyone.
I will argue, and this isn't an argument, but I would say that what attracted me to the conservative movement perhaps was that they were more likely to go out there and actually say things that people did not necessarily want to hear, more than perhaps the other left parties. And I could be wrong about that. I know that a friend of mine who's a New Democrat always an economist, always inflated and used numbers in our legislature to make his point. And we strongly felt that he was not being accurate. Your argument is about being accurate, I think, Francis. And in matters related to the schools, my argument is let's be accurate.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you more questions, and we're not going to be able to do that today.
Yes, Jim?
I might do it by sending you an email or something, but I wanted to ask you about things going on in some of our provinces with respect to pronouns. One of my pet peeves.
There's another hot button topic. See, that's one of the areas where, as a socialist, I think trans activism is not something socialists would support. But we can't even talk about that because we're going to get hit with all sorts of accusations of hate speech and so on. So this is where we're at. Anyway, Jim, it is, I think we've gone past the 2-hour mark, and I would love to continue, but our listeners, sorry, I should say, their time is limited, and we've probably already pushed the envelope a little bit in terms of time. So I would just like to thank you very much for agreeing to be on the Rational Space Disputations.
Thank you very much, Francis. It's been a pleasure.